Many people here in New Orleans also have pretty strong feelings about the Breonna Taylor case, and tonight they held a rally at Armstrong Park in her honor. Devin Bartolotta reports.
When you're looking at the population count,
hundreds of miles from Louisville.
This is not going away anytime soon.
Calls for justice for Breonna Taylor continued in New Orleans Thursday, and reactions to the decision not to indict police officers for her death continue to pour in. We spoke with Mark Morial, former mayor and current president of the National Urban League, and Majida Sneed, an attorney and law professor at Loyola.
It doesn't address what happened in Breonna Taylor's apartment at all. It talks about what happens in the neighbor's apartment. I think that's a travesty.
I don't know how anyone could look at this with a clear set of eyes and believe that this grand jury did the right thing.
There's fear that what happened to Breonna Taylor could happen in New Orleans, where no-knock warrants are still legal by state law.
The risk of life, the risk of a problem is high when you startle people at their door by just breaking the door down. This is the theory of a no-knock warrant, or the actuality of, without announcing that you are the police.
99% of police killings being never charged as crimes.
Once again, the fight for racial injustice brought young voices to the streets of New Orleans.
As long as I'm a black man who is a part of the marginalization and the disenfranchisement of what's going on in America, my fight will not cease.
Mobilizing Millennials encourage listeners to vote for candidates that will bring about change.
Just people being able to communicate across cities and states and countries have allowed for us to be able to examine the practices, not just in our city or state, but nationally.
And for those pushing for better practices, the time is now. In New Orleans, Devin Bartolotta, Eyewitness News.